artificially low. Now, I didn't really see the number of economically inactive people addressed in the country, and it has increased by 100,000 in this short period after I took out people over 60 years and students. So something is wrong. 100,000 people becoming economically inactive, something is wrong, and we need a distinct focus and study on that, because if we could bring this 100,000 people back into the labor force, we have a chance of revamping the economy. And then when you look at the ratio of output in the non-booming tradable sector to the non-tradable sector, it's so small. You need your non-booming tradable activity, which could bring in foreign exchange, to be a much significant proportion of the non-tradable sector. So that's some of the things that I think we need to address. Now, what more should the budget have included? Personally, I think that the budget needed to focus some more on the ratio of employment in the non-booming tradable to the non-tradable sector. In other words, we have an economy in which the number of people in the non-tradable sector has been growing too quick in relation to the number of people working in the non-booming tradable sector. That's not good. That's bad economics. And for years, this declined, and we didn't pay sufficient attention to it. We have to pay attention to that now. And another thing that we saw addressed in the budget that we have to be thankful for is the partial scope trade agreement. So the government introduced the suggestion of partial scope trade agreements with Ghana and India. I did a review of whether or not it is useful for a small country to be part of a partial scope trade agreement with a big country or a small country. And the information is clear. It is better for Trinidad and Tobago. If you look here, you would see it is better off when you form a PTA with a large rest of the world country, for example, India. It is better off than if you use a most favored nation tariff. And what happens is that your consumer surplus drifts towards that of free trade. So we want these bigger countries to form partial scope trade agreements with. You know, it's a long history of trying to develop partial scope trade agreements and trading ties with Africa, and we welcome that. And I did look at detail at some of the trade benefits, and you would see here that if I use trade complementarity as the basis to determine reciprocity and hence whether or not a trading partner is a natural trading partner, India certainly stands out as a real possible trading partner. And when I look at the welfare benefits from these trading agreements, India certainly it seems to be, based on the available data and the suggestion by the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago that they will form a PST with India, a reasonable candidate. Now, when I look at the data, one of the things I observe is that there is still tremendous scope for us to do more trade with CARICOM. CARICOM population is no longer the poultry population when we signed the free trade agreement back at the inception of CARIFTA. And also, the GDP in the region has grown considerably, although, as we know, Jamaica took a very bad hit this week. The GDP of the region is still very buoyant. And with the rebuilding of Jamaica, I'm sure there would be a lot of demand for goods produced in Trinidad and Tobago. One of the areas in which we have considerable room for growth is in the tourism sector. If you look at the data between 2019 and 2024, besides Cuba, we are the only country that had negative growth. And if you look at the data from 1995 to 2024, we are one of the slowest or the slower growing overall nation in terms of overnight visitor arrival traffic. Rebecca, I'm just doing a check to make sure that you all are hearing me.
Yes, Prof, go ahead.
Right. Now, where the budget fell short? The budget fell short in that I felt that it should have paid more attention to the transition probability matrix. Not in this specific language, but apart from something mentioned with TT Chamber, which I I think has a lot more depth to go into it. I think that was superficial. I think that a lot more thought needs to go into changing the probabilities associated with moving across different comparative advantage strengths. So if it is you have A, B, C, and D being 4 different areas of comparative advantage strength, with A being no comparative advantage and D being strong comparative advantage, ideally what you want is the first row of this matrix to have from A to B, A to C, and A to D to have very high values. And what you see is A to B is 0.006, A to C is 0.004, and A to D is 0.012. That is very low. And what this means is that the net sum of the policy interventions for trade in 2010 to 2024 was weak. And I didn't get the confidence coming out of the budget that was just read that it is going to change considerably. I commend the Ministry of Trade and the Minister of Finance for the suggestion of the PSTA, for the suggestion of the work that the TT Chamber would do. But I strongly think that more thought and more analysis has to go into this, because the few comments that I see, I think needs much more depth. In terms of the foreign exchange sales by authorized dealers, well, we all know that credit card and the new central bank governor did a good deal of work and shared some of this information, that we need to be more careful with credit card expenditure. And I see some banks have capped credit card expenditure at 2,500 US dollars per month, and we have to see how that goes. I suspect by next year that would probably have to come down by 1,500 to 1,500. We have to wait and see how that go. And now, one thing that I feel there is scope for is the percentage of foreign currency sales by the authorized dealers supplied by the central bank is about 20%. I think the central bank of TT need to sell this, or give this foreign exchange, or sell this foreign exchange directly to the Exim Bank and let the Exim Bank provide loans. Do not lend money, do not sell money to customers. Provide loans that are going to be repaid in US dollars. Otherwise, your very small stock of reserves that is now about $4.5 billion would disappear. You have to immediately, it would create some pain, cause the adjustment process to start, and let the Exim Bank provide loans to manufacturers and other people that sell in foreign exchange and earn foreign exchange, to replenish the stock of foreign exchange by repaying the Exim Bank in US dollars. That's what I think should be considered. I know some of that is already on the table. I think it needs to become more pronounced. Well, the commercial banking system in this country, from the little I understand, they have helped us plunge into this terrible situation we are in. And I hope that the commercial banks, I see they are trying now to provide more assistance to manufacturing. The horse has already bolted. Let's see how that goes. But I think they need to, the polluter pay principle should apply, and they have some work to do to help clean up this mess that they financed in this country. The difference between reserve and debt has plunged to -1 billion. I did a simulation where I assigned the Venezuelans by using the data in the IOM's data tracking matrix, in which the current allocation is 6% for import substitution, which I treat as agriculture, 5% for non-energy exports, which I treat as manufacturing, and 89% to the non-tradable sector. I think if we use worker permits and reallocate this labor, 9% to import substituting sectors, 75% to non-energy export sectors, and 16% to the non-tradable sector, we could increase our GDP in this country in the non-energy export or manufacturing sector from about 13 billion to about 26 billion, other things constant. This would require other supporting policy measures, but I think the labor force is the weakest link in the progress of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, alongside the availability of natural gas. And the Minister of Labor has to take this responsibility for increasing the labor force participation rate and assigning worker permits for the Venezuelan labor, because the labor force is in a total mess in terms of, I no longer pay attention to the unemployment rate. It means nothing to me. You look at the unemployment rate, it means nothing when you have an economically inactive population less students and less people over 60 years of over 300,000, and a labor force participation rate that has catapulted downwards to 55%. So you have to look at the whole labor market, and the Minister of Labor has a tremendous role to play in helping to fix this problem and build on what was not done before. He now has a chance to put on a cape and jump on a white horse and help save the labor force and by extension the economy. Rebecca, am I still on? I saw my PowerPoint just change for
Yes,
itself.
yes, Prof.
Okay, I
You're
wonder
on.
what happened here. I'm just not going to be distracted. I'm going to go straight back. Hold on. Okay, so I would stop there for the while, and any other questions I would pick up during the question and answers period. I will like to thank Indira and Dr. Tiwari for giving me the opportunity for using a few extra minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein. You made some really important points there. I mean, it's very worrying when we look at you made mention of the forex situation and what it could be again next year, and that in itself, is not something that we're looking forward to. But the truth is that the quicker that we can have this aspects of this economy diversify in large and small ways into export markets to earn forex, both in terms of, let's say, the physical trade and manufacture of goods, but also in services. It could be, it could help the situation. Now I'd like to introduce no stranger to these talks, and certainly if you've been reading the newspapers, listening to the radio, or going about and reading and going to like post-budget functions at many of the chambers, Dr. Indira Sajawan is certainly no stranger. She has really been everywhere, since the budget was laid, and she's been a keynote speaker at many of the business chambers, and she's also publicly in newspapers and in the media and so on, analyze the budget. And we're very happy to have her here today with us tonight. Dr. Indira Sajawan.
Thank you very much, Vivek. I want to say, Roger, I think you really put a lot in context in terms of the overarching framework for the economy of Trinidad and Tobago and really where we need to focus on. So I'm going to try in my presentation to, wherever I can, make the linkages to what you have said. And you've done some of it, and I would just kind of want to add some. I want to start off by saying that this is the first official policy statement that we are getting from this new administration in office, close to 6 months. And I found that it was different from the last 10 years in the sense that it somehow was able to provide a sense of optimism and confidence at the end of the reading. I mean, I was at the TT Chamber event the very next morning, and the manufacturers, they were very optimistic about what they heard. They were very supportive. I've read from EY, Ernst & Young, I think Price Waterhouse, and from all of these places, and we're hearing people being quite positive about a lot of the initiatives in the budget. The budget, I think the minister attempted to balance the need to find money with a social sensitivity in terms of trying to ensure that the burden of meeting the expenditure didn't fall on the average person or those who can't afford it. And we've had a lot of that over the years, and I felt that there was a strong sense of relief. And while the measures could possibly be passed on to everyone, we want to hope that where it fell in this instance, these sectors could not just afford it, but could absorb it. And we want to hope that we see more of that. Now, the budget, and I share Roger's sentiment, and there are things that concern me, and the obvious one would be the price assumptions that underlie this budget for gas and for oil. And based on this assumption, the government is actually projecting to get revenue from the energy sector of about close to $12 billion. And the fly in the ointment obviously is, if something happens that causes the prices not to be realized or production that they would have assumed to not come to pass, then obviously it means that there'll be a shortfall in terms of the revenue being projected on the from the energy sector. And then it makes an assumption that from the non-energy sector, it is going to get about $43 billion. Now, $43 billion compared to the last fiscal year when it was about $33 billion. That is quite a significant jump. And it has outlined some new areas where it is hoping to get this money from, and we will look at them, and it is for us to determine whether they are, the government has been realistic in terms of its expectation, because at the end of the day, if the revenue it is assuming of $55 billion doesn't happen, it means that the projected deficit of about $3.8 billion will actually increase immediately. And on the expenditure side, the budget is intended to spend about $59 billion. It relatively about the same as last year, just slightly down by a few hundred million, I think. But for the most part, it is about the same thing. So this is the situation. There's a heavier reliance almost immediately, Roger, on the non-energy sector in this budget. So almost immediately, we are seeing a shifting in terms of the reliance that the government is placing on the more towards the non-energy sector rather than what we traditionally know the energy sector. Now, in terms of trying to make up the money for this $59 billion, these are some of the initiatives that the government has put forward, and I'm sure persons here would have considered all of them. I think the challenges obviously is, will the banks and the insurance companies, will it pass it on to consumers, and therefore will it be inflationary? The landlord business surcharge, the government is hoping just through a registration process where persons who have over time, bought property and created spaces for rent, the government is now intending to charge a surcharge. But before the surcharge, just to register, the government is hoping to raise about $70 million through a registration process. I think it's a $2,500 registration process, and it's hoping to raise $70 million. It has not given us an estimate for how much it hopes to achieve from the surcharge itself. But herein, I anticipate there's going to be some amount of problem, because this is based on a willingness of landlords to come forward and register. There is no other mechanism in this current time other than government hoping that people will step up and say, well, listen, this is who I am, and they will register. So the relying or realizing of that is a little bit tricky. The electricity surcharge down is that simple, because that's an imposition that will be imposed on commercial and industrial users. That small increase. Noteworthy is that although this is an increase, it still keeps the electricity surcharge to the production element of the country extremely competitive, because the extent of the subsidy still remains quite high relative to competitive firms in countries around us. So the other issue is whether this will be absorbed or whether it will be passed on in the prices of goods and services. Increased excise duties, fees, and improved tax enforcement is the other mechanism. We know with respect to the increase in excise duties, we've already seen a lot of that on alcohol and I think cigarettes already being passed on to consumers. So that one, but the propensity we know to consume there is highly inelastic, so that what is hoped there is that the intended profit is going to materialize. So that is that. The other thing that concerns many persons, and it concerns me as well, is the fact that the government's commitment to this 10% increase to public servants, it has not been budgeted for. We don't know what the figure is. If it does happen in this fiscal year, that obviously means if the government chooses to pay it out in cash, it means it has to borrow in order to do that. That obviously increases the budget deficit, and it increases the government's indebtedness. I would like to suggest that the government attempts to use some creative mechanisms. It has already used the issue of long-term bonds for other issues, I think, in the payment of VAT to employees, and I want to encourage that it does that again in terms of spreading the burden over time and giving it time in the next few years to be able to ensure that the diversification effort that it is putting in place, the efforts it is making in the energy sector is actually realized. I want to also recommend that the government considers land for back pay. There's a huge element of this 10% that will be back pay. Monies that that is owing from a past time. Why not develop a large, extensive, or more than one parcels of development and offer to public servants in lieu of cash, offer them land. This could in turn then stimulate the construction industry, etc. But there is the positive element of this. You put cash in the hands of average person. We know most of what the average person, cash that comes in their hand, they spend. And spending is something that we need in this economy and in this moment in time in order to stimulate economic activity. We want to hope that the economic activity that it stimulates is not in terms of imported goods and services, but in terms of things that we can and we do produce here. Now, what I am very, very pleased about is the heavy focus in this budget on non-energy diversification. Now, it is not the first time. Other budgets have spoken to this. In fact, there are years when I would have quoted the number of times the word diversification would have appeared on the budget. But in this instance, it is not just a commitment to diversification as a concept. But for the first time, if a budget and this budget goes beyond just identifying new growth sectors, and none of them are new. They are the ones that we have always heard about: agriculture and agro-processing, light manufacturing, tourism, creative industries. We've heard these, and within there we've heard about health tourism, sport tourism, and a whole gamut of subsectors within these. What this budget does that I particularly like is it goes a step further than just identifying these sectors, and it sets targets. It sets targets so that people like myself and Roger and Dr. Tiwari can now use this as a measuring stick. And the government is very brave to have put these targets in here, because it must know, if they have put these targets, that people like us, we are now going to hold them to account. We are now going to be tracking to see what happens. So when next year's budget is read, we are going to want to know, for example, where are you with some of these commitments? So when we look at agriculture and agro-processing, the budget allocation is not magic that we had hoped for. We really, after you've spoken about it a lot, I had an expectation we would have heard a larger allocation to agriculture, just about $1.1 billion. It's not a lot. But the government has stated that there's a $793.7 million to be invested in irrigation, agri-tech, and fisheries. So that's kind of zero in an area where developmental money is going to go into. And that is something to be praised, and it's something for us to track. It has, in alignment with the CARICOM, when it was 25 by 25, but has since been changed by 25 by 30, meaning the CARICOM as a whole is aiming to reduce the food import bill to the region by 25% by 2030. The government is now doing similar and setting a target to reduce the local food import bill, which we all know stand at about $1.1 billion US dollars, over 7 billion TT dollars. They have set a target to reduce it by 25% by 2030. So in the next couple of years, we could actually be asking, at the end of year one, how much did you reduce it by? At the end of year two, and this data is available. It does another interesting thing, which I want to say something that I've spoken about, which I have always said. You need to take a fiscal year, and you need to say, in this year, we are going to prioritize this product, this primary product, and we are going to focus our energy here. What the budget says is they're going to take a 3-year priority commodities program. So basically, they're going to identify 15 key products, and they are going to take a 3-year cycle in terms of prioritizing 3. So in every 3 years, they're going to say that we are focusing on the development of these 3 sectors. And they've actually spoken about some of them, things like cocoa, hot peppers, etc. And this is something I think is very commendable, and I would like to see how it's rolled out. The budget speaks about climate resilience, smart, AI farming, crop insurance. Well, we know we've been hearing about crop insurance for a long time, but certainly climate smart and AI-driven agriculture is important for a small island state like ours, where climate change is a major disruptor, and where we have a situation where agriculture is competing with housing. And then finally, and this is very interesting, it projects to double the agro exports by 2028 and to reach 1 billion TT dollars by fiscal year 26-27. So within the next year and a half, the budget is hoping to expand exports of primary agricultural produce by $1 billion. Cocoa, maruga pepper, aquaculture. So let's see how that rolls out. Tourism is another, and Roger, you made that point where you were seeing a heavier focus on tourism. And I was making the point earlier today, and I'll make it again. Grenada's visitor arrival is over 300,000 persons per year. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, already up to that and probably surpassing that. In the case of just Tobago, which is just 33 square kilometers larger than Grenada, visitor arrival pre-COVID was about a little over 100,000 persons. It has not reached back to that level post-COVID. It's 2 small, tiny little countries, and we've not even factored in Trinidad and Tobago. I imagine if we really put effort into promoting tourism in the Twin Island, what we could do. But the government has set some targets. It's hoping to bring investment. It doesn't tell us whether this investment is going to be of FDI or local or what kind of combination. That's a question to be asked. But it intends to bring in $3 billion in investment in the next 2 years and $9 billion US over the next 5 years. Again, a measurement variable we could look at. It is focusing on a PPP approach to the development of marinas, hotels, etc. So government itself is not going to simply be putting money, it's going to be partnering with the private sector. Some niches are identified, talks about a year-round carnival city, and we've heard the Minister of Trade talk about this a lot. This is a new one, turtle tourism, but again, a no-brainer, because we all know what Trinidad is to turtles. So that focusing here in terms of product development, I think that is an extremely good idea. We already have things happening, and it's therefore easy to build it out. And then this last one in terms of the Creative Industry Fund, I think that is an old initiative that we've had. I like particularly that it singles out yachting and marine services as a growth sector, even though it's a subset of agriculture, because this is one that we could see turn around, and we could see significant activity happening in no space of time. And its impediments are bureaucratic, simple bureaucratic impediments that has riddled the yachting industry for maybe longer than I have been alive, and that's a long, long time. And even though the industry has been begging government after government to address them, they have not done so. Move from 15 forms to one harmonized form all over the other islands, and you all know I've been belaboring this whole issue. So if government is able to do this very quickly, it has set a goal of making Trinidad and Tobago the premier Southern Caribbean yachting and marine services hub. Now, we were well on the way to this in 2011, and again, bad government policy brought it to death's door. The servicing element of this entire industry, which we were world known for, we literally destroyed because government policy decided that we just didn't want to go that route. And again, linked to the issue of CPEP and URP, I am told by the persons in this industry, a young man living in Laventille or in any disadvantaged community could jump on a bus, come into into Shagaramas, and in one day earn 150 to 200 US dollars. He could have that in his pocket in one day. Is CPEP and URP really a worthy substitute to something like that if we develop it? More than that, there are so many opportunities, jobs, sustainable job opportunities that can be created in an industry like that. If we focus on really in a big way in marine services, the servicing of yachts, especially in today's world, are specialized skills, and we would then need to engage in human capital development, training initiatives, in order to be able to provide the human capital for that. yachts coming in, if we focus in on the area of what is it, what I'm looking for yachts it is when persons come, they fly in and they charter, the chartering element of the yachting industry. That is this element where the most money is made. And it is the element where countries like St. Martin, if they specialize in that and they capture the market and that. But Trinidad and Tobago were ideally located to be able to leverage in this area. And these yachts, they need young men who will then, do all the needful in terms of making the yacht go. They will need a captain, they will need cooks, they will need so many skill sets that we could then be developing in order to be able to service this industry. I will say no more on this because, there is a lot. Manufacturing in the SME, I think this is what you may have alluded to, Roger, the Export Academy that is to be done together with the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber and the IDB, where they're hoping to train 100 export-ready SMEs annually. I mean, that's all we heard in the budget, but of course, now the Exim Bank focus. Now, Roger, I heard you talk about the allocation that the central bank, the gap that it fills for the commercial banks. And I support your position with respect to the Exim Bank. And, people don't know, but in the Exim Bank, what was set up during COVID was a window that was set up for essential, where persons who were important essential things like essential drugs and essential food would access foreign exchange under this window in order to bring it back. You would think it would have peaked then and it would have leveled off and been reduced over time. If you see the numbers, it has actually grown maybe by a couple of 100% over the last few years. And I'm not sure what essential really is under that element, because I have seen where money is allocated to companies, when I look at what they are bringing in, nothing is essential. So we need to go back that. And the Minister of Finance did talk about the issue of moving, and the budget does speak about the Exim Bank moving to a situation where they don't simply allocate the foreign exchange, but they actually lend the foreign exchange. And the anticipation is that you will then be repaying it also in foreign exchange, which will encourage manufacturers to bring back foreign exchange, because what we know is manufacturers and persons are accessing the foreign exchange here. They are using it through the Exim Bank. They are probably banking their profits in US dollars outside and then coming back to the Exim Bank and asking for maybe the same amount of more forex in order to continue business. So I totally support that particular initiative. And yeah, so these are the areas. It talks a lot about, especially as the interest of young people, of ICT, of technology driven, and the whole modernization of things like the customs, etc., the Inland Revenue Department. All of these areas, the budget talks about modernizing through technology, and therefore I think in there a lot of job opportunities could be created. And I particularly like, Roger, you didn't mention it, but the NIS, I think this government is to be commended for taking the bull by its horn and actually doing something to protect the national insurance scheme, because it was just a problem that was being kicked down the road for somebody else to deal with, and that this Minister of Finance has done it through two mechanisms, by increasing the contribution. I know some people are upset about that. I know, because it means you have to pay more. But at the end of the day, what's the alternative? Allow the system to crash? Because how else could it be saved? And then the issue of the raising the retirement age. Now, he could have chosen to simply raise it immediately or raise it by next year, but he's chosen instead a phased approach in order to satisfy those who may be unhappy with it, that they have some time to leave or to adjust to this new approach. I particularly like the focus on control and accountability. I like that the Prime Minister herself has taken chairmanship of and through the creation of a Financial Oversight and Appropriation Committee. This is to be chaired by the Prime Minister, and it is to be co-chaired, or deputy chair would be the Minister of Finance, because every major project is therefore to have this level of oversight. Now, some people this could be looked at some levels as micromanagement, but when we have heard the kind of corruption and the kind of misappropriation of monies that we have heard about since the new government comes into place, I am heartened that the Prime Minister is putting herself forward to say, listen, I'm taking ownership of this. And then there's something called an Economic Resilience Council that the Minister of Finance will chair. And this one too is any project, I think over $50 million, I think, must come here for oversight and for approval. And then there's significant reform. It speaks of IRD and customs. And I won't go into the detail of that. At the end of the day, you know, I think it's a good budget. It's a budget that gives us a sense of hope. It's a budget that allows us to be able to track and monitor government's performance in a lot stronger way than we have been able to in the past. But of course, there are challenges. I too question whether we will actually have a deficit as small as it is. My expectation was that the deficit would have been a lot larger than it was. But let us see what unfolds, because even the issue of the increased NIS payment, I don't think it's something that was budgeted for. So there is that. Of course, the risks that we face, energy price volatility, inflationary pass-through, project execution delay, because at the end of the day, it's implement, and start yesterday. And I totally agree with Roger. The only conversation we should be having in the national space is, what are we doing to generate foreign exchange? Not just what are we doing to support domestic manufacturing, you know, it is what are we doing to generate foreign exchange, because at the end of the day, that is what is important. Now, I do believe the non-energy diversification effort needs a champion. It needs a champion. And whether it is to be the Economic Development Board that is proposed, or the Council for and Council of Competitiveness, or the Economic Council the Minister of Finance is projecting, I am not sure, but it certainly needs an entity that could pull together all the elements, because we have various ministries that may take responsibility for different elements. But what I believe we need is an overarching entity, much like the Economic Development Board in Singapore does. We need an entity like that that takes overall responsibility for ensuring that all those who need to get things done, including the private sector, including the educational sector, all of these sectors together, really through cluster mapping in terms of what needs to be done going forward. And at the end of the day, I want to end on a positive note. I believe that this budget, you know, it renewed investor confidence, and I, unfortunately, it was followed immediately by all of what is happening with respect to Venezuela and the US and talk of war and all of these things, followed by this massive hurricane in Jamaica, which impacts all of us. But at the end of the day, I think that it is a good pivot. It is a good start, and let us wait and see what happens. And the evidence of its goodness, really, at the end of the day, will be in execution and delivery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Indira, for that very detailed look at the budget, very granular as well, too. Thank you very much. At this point in time, we'd like to introduce again another stalwart, someone who has become a household name. He has an article, he has a column in the newspapers. He regularly comments on government and society from his Facebook page. He himself has been a speaker at many business functions. He's been on media as well too. Professor Dr. Boindranath Tiwari. In addition to this, he's also been a very good friend and proponent for SMEs in Trinidad and Tobago, and one of the founding fathers of the chamber of which I am the chairman, the Confederation of Regional Business Chambers. Dr. Boindranath Tiwari.
Thank you very much, Vivek, and good evening to all of you who have taken time to engage us. You've listened to two very, very formidable presentations. One really sort of, the one by Professor Hussein, really focusing on what he sees are the critical things you have to begin to address now as you address the issues of transforming the
economy, whether you talk about workers and the kind of work, whether you talk about how you manage trade, and the significance of CARICOM because it has greater potential than we have been leveraging. And some of those things are really, really important because it needs, if you're going to do this, organization and strategy and capability in terms of competence in order to get these things done. And we heard a really positive presentation from Indira, from Dr. Sajiwan, in which she looked at elements of the budget and talked about its value, the value of some of them, and added her own views of how she felt some of these might be better leveraged or work better. And given the presentations before, I think I had planned to do certain things, but I will do one or two things and share some thoughts with you. When you look at the budget this time on the whole, it really tries to address serious challenges and to posit solutions for them. For instance, it addresses the mounting fiscal pressures in the economy. It tries to address some of the structural economic weaknesses. In terms of fiscal pressures, you can see that in the attempt to have a low deficit. In terms of the structural economic weaknesses, you could see the movement to non-energy. And this particular budget really focuses on non-energy revenue as best it can in the circumstances, because I want to say, in all fairness to the government, that they really are caught in a kind of box, given the situation we are dealing with in Trinidad and Tobago. And in my article this morning in The Guardian, I write every Thursday, what I tried to do was to show that the government is really in a box, but you have to find a way to get out. And I was also indicating that if you don't find a way to get out quick, you have 6 months of import cover that will be depleted. And secondly, if the revenue is not realized and the expenditure that is not mentioned and allocated in the budget comes on stream, you're going to have such a significant deficit that you are going to have to draw down on the HSF. So those were the three messages of my article this morning. We are in a box. We have to do something now. We have 6 months of import cover. You have to do it before that finish. And if the revenue and expenditure balance that you are seeking is not realized and you have a higher deficit, you might have to go down in the HSF. And I was trying to put that squarely, as kindly as I could this morning, and in a restrained way, because this country is very alarmist, and people go to the extreme in their assessments and their pronouncements, and the end result is a lot of anxiety and a lot of chaos. Now, there is also in this particular budget statement a trust as well, even while they focus on non-energy. There's a trust still to revitalize the energy sector, even as the emphasis and focus is on non-energy. Now, given that our budget covers only 1 year, and Roger spoke to this, he talked about the fact that what he is concerned about is the medium term, a 3-year or 4-year period. Given that the budget covers only 1 year, what the Minister of Finance tried to do in this budget was really very commendable. And what we should be concerned about is whether or not it will be done, not whether it can be done. Anything can be done. But the question really is, will it be done? And for it to be done, you have to focus on the implementation requirements within a specific period of time. And what is the organization capacity and the resource capacity and the competence capacity that you need to get the results that you require. And I think that is where the government should be thinking and focusing now, or else the budget will pass as time passes, and it would be very hard to account for any real results or achievement. Now, let's look at some of the proposed solutions in the budget. You have new tax measures. You have transfer pricing legislation announced, which means that that is a revenue measure. You have a modernization of the taxation system attempted. You have the elimination of CPEP and URP and the transformation of that. You have some revenue expected from the energy sector. You have VAT relief for agricultural machinery. And then you have the establishment of 2 committees, the Financial Oversight and Appropriation Committee and the Economic Resilience Council. So I think the thinking was good, which is that we've got to address the issue of revenue. We've got to address the issue of transformation and modernization. We've got to address the issue of diversification and development. And we've got to have a mechanism that will monitor and perhaps manage that to make sure that we get it done. So there is nothing faulty in the thinking, but between thinking and action is a very, very huge gap. And I would ask the government to consider really putting these things in place very early in order to get the job done. There are other measures in the budget, diversification. Indira dealt at length with that. Crime as an economic imperative. Now, I want to say this was a very good thing in the budget, because they saw crime not just as a matter of criminality and not just as an issue of murders and so on, but they saw crime as an economic imperative. And that kind of thinking, I think, is very important. Of course, the Forex issue cannot be avoided. They talked about promoting technology and innovation, and they talked about in the budget about the issue of long-term sustainability. But even in all of that, there are important concerns that I want to raise. First of all, the expenditure is not fully factored in the budget. And the loan financing is also not fully factored in the budget. And I think if you factor those things, you will see that there is no way the deficit can hold, especially if you have a shortfall in revenue. Secondly, there is still an over-reliance on oil and gas in the budget. The budget is premised on a very high price for oil and natural gas, and on production numbers that may or may not be realized. So I think that is a challenge. It is a problem. It has to be monitored, and you have to prepare for if it does not happen. Secondly, some of the taxation measures and the impositions on business, etc., may prove to be inflationary. Other people have said that because people know that there is no way that you're going to add a taxation burden on a functioning entity in an economic system in the marketplace, and that is not going to be reflected in terms of impact on the marketplace. So there is an inflationary possibility from some of the measures in this budget. And then finally, the increasing public debt and almost $10 billion in foreign currency loans are targeted. When you look at the documents properly, when you mention that and you mention investment and you mention the issue of fiscal discipline, which the budget actually acknowledges, especially with the two monitoring institutions that it mentions, I think you can see that there is a built-in tension between these three things: public debt, investment, and fiscal discipline. And there might be a kind of working at contradictory purposes in the budget as, you know, people begin to do their thing, etc., with the allocations that they have. Now, let us look at the new tax measures, right? The problem that the government wants to address there is revenue generation. They want to bring down the fiscal deficit, and they want to bring down the cost of subsidies, although they gave a little bly with the gas, the gas, and they want, of course, to exercise a fairer system of taxation. So they had the landlord business surcharge, the electricity surcharge on commercial and industrial users. You had an asset levy on banks, insurance, increased excise duties. Now, the surcharges may raise concerns about increased operating costs for business and therefore have an impact that ripples downwards and upwards. Now, there's no prediction that we're going to have a significant rise in inflation. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that if you do this, you must be aware that there is an inflationary possibility built into these measures, and therefore you have to plan accordingly, and you have to organize and strategize accordingly to manage things before they happen, and should things happen, to manage that precisely. The other issue in there is the non-oil revenue-based revenue, which is projected 43.4 billion, which is 78% of total revenue of this budget, and which through that projection of 43 billion or 78% of the revenue, you are going to reduce the fiscal deficit to a projected 2.17. I think that is some real hard maths. Okay? So I would not make the assumption that all of this is going to work. And therefore, I would work these measures in such a way that you realize the anticipated result of your assumptions. And I would suggest that you get a smart, wise team to begin to look at this from the very beginning. The other thing is transfer pricing legislation. Why do they want that? Because of revenue leakage, and it's a big leakage. Secondly, it's an international tax. And thirdly, it's addressing the problem of compliance and a fair share of taxes from the multinational corporations. Now, in the last 8 years, prior to 2024, $17.5 billion have been lost in revenue because of not having reasonable policies to be able to capture these things. And if you have the transfer pricing taxes, it also improves your international standing because you are now aligned with global taxation standards, which is always good for the country when we are looked upon by international agencies, international investors, etc. We just brought in Exxon here as a new investor in energy, and hopefully we can bring in non-energy investors into the country. Successes, but success in this area, that is to say, in the area that has to do with transfer pricing, hinges on the primary and secondary legislation and effective enforcement. So those are three things. You have to make sure you get the legislation that actually does what you intend to, and that could be easily done by looking at what other people have done. But the other thing is, how do you enforce it? The enforcement of, what can I say, well-deserved fair energy rents in Trinidad and Tobago throughout our energy history has not been effectively done in this country. Then you have the modernization of the taxation system. I think after this one, I will just stop so that we can have a discussion. I have many other things, but I'll just stop at this one. The modernization of this taxation system, you have the general tax, which is that as you buy your thing, you pay at the counter one time on the register. Then you have ASICUDA. I have a problem with that. I don't know. I can't remember how far back I have been hearing about this ASICUDA system that cannot work up to now. And I cannot believe it has anything to do with technology, competence, or anything else. I feel that it has to do with crime. I think it has to do with corruption. And unless we are prepared to deal with that, we are going to have a difficult situation here. And the hiring of 300 revenue officers, it doesn't make sense to hire them if you don't train them properly, and if you don't know what your tax policy is meant to achieve. So I would suspect that somebody would be thinking about that and decide to do it properly, because what you are after in the modernization of the tax system is inefficient revenue collection, tax evasion, and lack of reliable data. And what we have done is that the government has foregone the revenue authority, which was meant to do that, and is working now with this taxation system with the inland revenue, the customs, etc., to try and realize revenue. Now, if we do this right, it has a high potential to enhance the efficiency, transparency, and collection of taxes. But you have to build honesty into the system. If the crookedness, the corruption continues, it is not going to make any difference. And we have to acknowledge that at the heart of this system is a lot of crookedness and corruption. And therefore, we must build our strategy with a knowledge of that. And the system has to be cleaned up for it to be transparent and efficient. And then we have to address the structural weaknesses in the taxation system as well. There are a lot of people in this country who are doing business and who are not in the tax net. I am not for penalizing people. All I am saying is go to them, tell them they have to be in the tax net, let them register, bring them in, and let them start paying taxes. So I will stop at this point. From the three measures that I've dealt with, the landlord business surcharge and the other surcharges, the transfer pricing legislation and the modernization of taxes. What I've tried to show is that just because you announce something in the budget doesn't mean anything will happen. And just because you have good intentions, it does not mean that those good intentions will be realized. Trinidad and Tobago is a very complex place. You have resistance everywhere. You have sabotage as a part of the national culture. Rex Nettleford, who used to be the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, said once to me, I was in a public occasion and we were speaking. He said the people in the Caribbean have knowledge and history of 400 years of sabotage. And it is the truth. And corruption is rife. It is everywhere. So if we're going to get the country right, you have to make up your mind to know that a lot of things are wrong and they have to be corrected, or else you cannot get a decent and reasonable country. And you can't have any serious development in a corrupt country, let me tell you. So having said that, I will now withdraw and end my contribution. And if there are questions that I can answer, I will contribute in the question and answer period. Edward.
Okay, good evening, everyone. At this point in time, we shall take questions. So I shall go to the chat and let's see what are some of the first new chat. Okay, I got it. Here we go. So the first goes to with respect to congestion costs. This is by Giovanni Alvarez asking this question. Good night. With respect to congestion costs and the negative externalities associated with automobile use, do you think the government's measures such as increased duties on electric vehicles, planned expansion of subsidized public transport through the introduction of smart buses and the increase in fees for careless driving effectively addresses the economic cost of congestion?
Dr. Tiwari, you want to go first on that one?
Well, I don't know, is the problem whether it's going to solve the congestion problem on the road? Is that it?
Question, yeah, that is the question.
Well, I mean, Trinidad and Tobago has to solve the transportation problem because that is a serious and deep hindrance to productivity in the country. And I don't know if those three measures are going to solve it. I think what will solve it is if you have either, you need to have specialized buses that take you from a point of parking to the point where you can go to work, and buses or walking take you closer to your work. That would be one way to do it. Or you could do a train, which was going to take years, but with bus you can do it quickly. And I think that you could have staggered working hours, which has been mentioned 100 million times in this country over the last 2 decades. And you can have work from home days in which you have good productivity systems in which people's work are measures, so they don't stay home to lime and to take a day off. So I believe that if you're going to deal with the question of productivity hindered by traffic and time on the road, then you must deal with it properly. And you also have to take a people-centered approach to this. The Prime Minister is very strong on the idea. Every time she talks, she said hers is a people-centered government and people-centered policy. You have to take into account the realities of Trinidad and Tobago. People come to work, but they have children in school. They have to deal with transportation. Their children have after-school activities. You know, they might go to swim, or they might play tennis, or they might play football, or whatever it is. So what you want to do is to capture the productivity strategy around the cultural and developmental necessities of home, family, and workplace. And I don't think it's a simple measure that could be solved just so by doing this and doing that and doing the other.
If I could also add here, one of the major issues that affects productivity, particularly if we want to really deal with finding jobs and dealing with poverty, as well as diversifying into a manufacturing export-oriented economy that has a lot of manufacturing in it, and such, and as such, there are new opportunities. The one of the largest costs that labor has to deal with is the cost of transport, or traveling, as we colloquially put it, from areas of very urban, rural areas with very little jobs and work and so on, to more built up areas. And those costs keep increasing, and it takes a hefty hefty bite um, out of their weekly salaries when they're working on minimum wage. And so you find that there's a marked reluctance, and they say it doesn't make sense. It don't make sense for me to travel from Grandy to Port of Spain. It don't make sense for me to travel from um, deep down south or deep east to go to Port of Spain, because by the end of the week, after I factor in other things, 3/4 or half of my salary gone. And so there's the idea of how do we move people cheaply from areas that are poor, unskilled areas, or areas that have very little commercial activity, to areas that do. And when you look at larger manufacturing countries like China and India and so on, well, let's say particularly China, they've managed to do that because they have a rail system and so on. We don't have a rail system, and we can't really, quickly adapt to putting a rail system in place.
We could
But
do
the
it. We'd be
innovative.
small enough to do it with buses.
Right. So the idea is, how, and that's why the Venezuelan um, labor force has been so easily absorbed into our labor force on all levels, right? From the market level to warehouses of manufacturing companies in contract labor that working for multinational companies and conglomerates, even though they're not registered or quote unquote legal labor. And the reason for that is they are renting, right? They are renting in areas of commercial activity, so they don't have those costs. Whereas citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, sometimes you have 2 generations or 3 generations living in the family home because they own the plot of land and they own the home they're in. And they are not going to take the risk or the cost of moving out from their rural home of years or decades to work in to move to a commercial area to work, because the cost of rent is the cost of rent is really high for
Yeah.
them. So it's difficult. Whereas we find like the Venezuelans will pool together, right? There'll be 5 people staying there, and so one of the issues with transport as well too, other than congestion on the road and externalities that affects productivity, is how do we really get people from areas of low commercial activity, rural areas where there's a certain amount of poverty, um, to areas, let's say like e-tech parks, if e-tech parks were to get going, right? Places like that. How do we get labor to work in areas of commercial activity?
Well, all
Another.
those things could be worked out. If Vivek and Dr. Tiwari did say as much. I mean, there is nothing stopping us from putting a e-tech park in Moonga as we did. Nothing stopping us from putting us an e-tech park in CJOS. And that's why the whole budget has to be lodged in the context of a bigger picture. But
That's right.
I mean, we could debate at another time. What I simply want to say, in addition to what Dr. Tiwari said in response to Giovanni, is that I really believe people who want new cars should come with the US dollars. We have a situation where for the next 3 years, we are on the border of not being able to have money for medicine just now, for pharmaceuticals, for food imports, which I checked today. I see people keep saying 7 billion. When I checked the World Integrated Trade System site, I saw 1.3 billion, which US, which is 7 3s are 21, 7 1s are 7, and 2 is 9 billion TT. That's a lot more than 7 billion. So,
Yeah, for
but I
sure.
use 7 to 1, eh? Anyway, I simply would like to add that the new car market has exhausted billions of US dollars over the last 25 years. And at this point, I don't know that we could continue on that straight line. Some kind of further barrier has to be put for certain kind of consumption. And here's what, at the same point in time, we don't want to limit anybody getting access to a new car. So the simple thing is come with your Forex. Come with your Forex for a new car. That will not be something that the population finds attractive. But when your reserves are down to 5.4 months of import cover, and that's excluding the amount of external debt you have to make hard decisions.
And well, Professor, next issue is, when we look at the fact that the non-tradable sector, manufacturing sector, has shown to have some growth, right? And they contributed to what the previous Minister of Finance called economic growth, 1% or how much it was, or 2% or whatever. And that they have grown, right? Our manufacturing sector. Have we really seen, and then we look at a situation where I have it on good authority that from the previous administration, that all the e-tech parks are full. There's no room, absolutely no room in any of the e-tech parks. Has that translated to, the labor force? Have we really seen from your studies, your research, you are saying that the labor force or the labor participation rate hasn't really increased. So if we see that the e-tech parks have been full, we see that manufacturing has been growing, then why hasn't there been a correlation or an increase with, let's say, a direct increase in the labor participation rate? Why haven't we seen more unskilled labor being picked up?
Dr.
Right?
Tiwari, I would respond first on this one. So what is happening there, Vivek, is that, you see, all growth is not economic growth that we need in this country. Economic growth that leads to an excessive drawdown on the stock of foreign exchange reserves. The problem is like if you have diabetes, and I hope I'm using this example correct. At first, if you have diabetes, I think a doctor would say to you, use diet and exercise. As it progresses, he would say to you, use diet and exercise and some tablets. And as it progresses, you may have to use actual insulin injection. I hope I have the sequence correct. Now, what I'm saying to you is our problem has moved away from generating growth. We have moved out of that field, and we are now in the field of we have to generate growth that leads to more foreign exchange. And so the e-tech, hold on, I feel interesting. The e-tech park system needs a complete overhaul. It's so difficult, Vivek, to get information out of e-tech. I have been asking e-tech for a few years now, semi-formally, can I get a report on e-tech? Can I get a report on the profitability of e-tech? How much foreign exchange it generates? How much employment it generates? How much of the firms are import for distribution? Nothing. You just keep coming up against wall. People turn you on from one person to another person to another person, and nothing. And it compromises the progress of the country. I hope now that the new chairman, I forgot her name, I hope she takes this very seriously. e-tech has a responsibility to account to the population and to provide information to the population. Otherwise, how else can the technocrats make informed decisions? Anyway, there are a few more questions, and that's all I will add.
Let me go on to the other questions. Many businesses use migrant workers, mostly undocumented. Maybe this can be the reason why the labor participation rate is stagnant. The Anybody would care to respond to that? Or here's another one. Why are some mechanisms you suggest that the government and TT do to improve the labor force participation rate for citizens? We are seeing, well, all of this seems to be about labor. We are seeing many firms like Nestle are seeking to cut jobs, largely owing to the increased utilization of AI-related technologies. According to the IMF, 40% of jobs are vulnerable to AI in developing countries. It's only a matter of time before AI becomes a substitute, thus adversely affecting the LF participation, labor force participation rate, despite improving operational efficiencies. What would be your recommendation in this scenario? So we have 3 questions there.
Yeah.
Well, 4 questions there on the labor force participation rate. What are your right? What we do to improve it? So who would care to talk about how we improve the
Larry, you
labor
want to go first and I will
participation?
just back you up?
No, go ahead now. Labor participation is your thing.
No problem. So
Yeah.
first to begin, the population needs to be clear that the labor force is in a mess. We look and we see in the July 2025 second quarter, I think they quoted some ridiculously low unemployment rate, like 3.8%, which is substantively, I have confidence in CSO numbers, so I'm not going to say the 3.8% is wrong. I'm going to say that the 3.8% is absolutely meaningless if you have a labor force participation rate that has plunged to 55.4%, if I remember correctly, and an economically inactive population that has surged to 311,000 after you take out students and after you take out people over 60 years. So something has gone wrong in the labor force. You ask the commercial banks to let us look at the labor force because, you know, there is some kind of perverse situation going on here. No response. Now, I have confidence in this Minister of Labor. He has a great deal of experience in the labor sector. And so I am hoping that he places a lot of attention on the necessary changes to be made to improve the labor force participation rate. Nice dog, Vivek. I already noticed there were some changes made to NIS. There were some changes proposed for the retirement age. And those are good steps. We have to now understand why people are leaving the labor force. Is it to provide childcare facilities? Is it to provide care for an aging population? We have to understand why. And only when we scientifically understand why, we would know how to counter it. But the base work is not being done and the fundamental research exists nowhere. So we are hitting in the dark. And that's not the way to do a scientific intervention.
I also want to make a submission, which is, you know, one of the issues that affect the labor participation rate too is the amount of young men that's been radicalized into crime. We have, you know, we have had a lot of dropouts from school since COVID. That has been quantified actually, and it's quite disturbing. But other than that, certainly we have a lot of young men who have decided to get into a life of crime. Secondly, I honestly believe that the migrant situation, the Latin American migrant situation, particularly from Venezuela and Cuba and so on, has taken a lot of jobs. And it has taken a lot of jobs because of the ease at which these people can be hired. They stay in the jobs as well too. They are closer to the jobs, as I said, than many of our citizens. But also despite the fact that we've been told that the manufacturing sector has been doing well, there are other sectors that have, in my opinion, outperformed the manufacturing sector. One of them is real estate. There has been a lot of real estate developments that have gone up over the last 10 years, particularly commercial real estates. When you look at all the malls and strip malls and commercial buildings have been going up, and also private houses, that sort of thing. Those things whereas they're supposed to draw a lot of labor, particularly in construction, we find that the construction companies who have really done this haven't really, I haven't seen that, them hiring as many people as they have. And again, when you look at when you walk on a construction site, you're seeing a lot of migrant labor as well too. The second thing is when you look at distribution type businesses, right? And that distribution sector has been huge. You're looking at pharmaceuticals, the majority of which are imported. You're looking at food, the majority of which have been imported. You're looking at giants in food distribution, giants in pharmaceutical pharmaceutical distribution, importation, right? And you're realizing that, in terms of their hiring, what they really have is a small administrative staff, warehouse staff, and then drivers so you find that there isn't really a turnover of labor. You find that there haven't really been there's not an expansion of premises or expansion of industry to say or plan to anything like that to say that they're hiring more people as well too. And so where money has been invested in the country has not directly benefited the labor market in terms of providing more jobs. And the funny thing is, and this is just a side observation, but funny thing is, in all this, fracas about between Venezuela and Trinidad and so on, and the Venezuelan government saying bad things about the government of Trinidad, the fact of the matter is that the private sector in Trinidad and Tobago have treated the Venezuelan citizens that left their country very well. They helped them put food on the table. They hired them for all these years. They looked after them, to a large degree, and they continue to do so. So I think we've actually done the private sector in Trinidad and Tobago has actually done the government of Venezuela and the citizens of Venezuela a huge favor, because it was not the government of Trinidad and Tobago that looked after them for all these years. It is indeed the private sector who have made them very comfortable and put food on their table and help them to pay their bills. But that
Except
being
the
said,
government of Trinidad and Tobago, Vivek, waived the formation of a worker permit, provided them with national security, provided them with some medical care, and I mean, it adds up into millions. I worked it out at one point in time. So we cannot ignore that, but I see your point.
right, I agree. And if we're looking at ways in which to earn additional revenue, the government, then maybe registration of work permits for 30 to 40,000 migrant workers in Trinidad and Tobago, if in fact there are so much, and they contributed in some form or fashion
And none of
by
them
a
should be
tax or
able to
something like
work
that,
in
they could work.
bars. We should ban them from working in bars and casinos, so that immediately unlocks a portion of labor to go in agriculture or manufacturing, because that's where a lot of them gravitate.
Could I jump in there? That point you just made about what kind of jobs and where they work. And it's not just Venezuelans, it's the whole structure of the economy and consequently the workforce. Many years ago, I can't remember how long ago, but it must be over a decade, Roger and I did a book in which he focused on the Dutch disease issue. But one of the things that came out of it is that there were two economies, the energy economy and the non-energy economy. And I would add to that, there's a third part, which is the state economy, which would include not just the public service and the state enterprises, but the patronage part of the state economy. And when you put these things together, you begin to see how lack of productivity is built into the structure of the economy. So what I would say is that what we need to go after now are good jobs. And you can only get good jobs now no longer from energy. That's not possible. Whatever you have there, you could keep, but you're going to get very little new jobs from there. And in any case, it's a low quantity of jobs, percentage-wise, proportionately to the rest of the economy. So what we need to do is to get the investment, local and foreign, to come here to create non-energy export products. And more than that, you need to move up the value chain. We have 400 IT people graduating for the last 20 years out of university in ICT. Infosys and not Microsoft, Cisco, and all of those companies have been taking them for years. So many of them migrate to Canada on the basis of their credentials and so on. So we need to use the labor force in a smart way. We are not using the Venezuelan labor force smartly. All right, we are not deploying them in any productive thing. So they're gone in the services sector, the non-tradable goods sector, and they're making a living, but they're not adding anything. So, I mean, somebody with a mind has to look at the economy, see what people have written, what they have said, whether it makes sense, and begin to call some people to think through, well, what do we do? All right, with the economy? What do we do with investment? How do we deploy the labor force? How do we absorb the throughput from the university? What do we do with the graduates from high school who need to work for a year or two before they go to university? What do we do with the dropouts from high school who might go into crime? What is the track that we make? I mean, this is a human development issue.
Yeah, 100% correct. I agree. What do we do with all those lawyers graduating every year from Hewooden, being called to the
Exactly.
bar? What
So,
do we
so
do with
it's a
coming out
huge.
from Mount Hope
They
doctors?
can all be absorbed because there's only a handful in the world. It might be big for here, but it's just a handful. There are lots of things that we could do, but somebody has to mindfully focus on how you do these things. You know, Costa Rica used to be a tourism destination. They used to have about 400,000 or 500,000 tourists a year. They decide they're going to have 100,000 a year. They end up with 1.2 million, 100,000 a month. They end up with 1.2 million a year. And then when they start to do that and they make themselves the eco-tourism capital of the Western Hemisphere, what they did is that they went and they get intel and they bring them. And they say, look, we want to take technology, infuse it in the university system, and we want to create technological jobs. And they work with Intel, and Intel work with other companies, and they bring them in. Well, we are past that stage now. What we have to work with is the AI companies. We have to work with the technologically driven companies, the robotics companies, the innovation companies in technology, those in the service industry and technology-driven industries, and see how we could manage human resource development needs, investment ambitions of other companies, logistical realities of Trinidad and Tobago in relation to the Latin American region, etc. I mean, I don't know. I mean, do we just talk here or do we think and act? I mean, really.
Vivek, I'm
Hi.
going to ask you for permission to reply to 3 questions in 35 seconds each.
Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
Okay, at 8:24, someone asked about NIB. I saw the government made some changes in the budget, and I hope that we see them actually execute on it, and it's a good step in the right direction. I think someone asked I know I saw a question from Chelsea Campbell. What are some of the mechanisms you could use to improve the labor force participation rate? Well, first, we have to understand why it is declining. Other than that, we will be guessing. So I think that we need to do a solid technocratic study and understand what is going on. Is it that it's crime? Is it that we are going into gangs? Is it that we are going to sell more drugs? Is it some type of activity like that? And so we need to understand it better. I can't understand why a formal understanding of the labor force participation rate has not been conducted by the Ministry of Labor, given the collapse. It's one of the worst in the Caribbean. The next question was by Professor Gonzalez, and all I would say to Professor Gonzalez is it would some of the estimated numbers like oil price and gas price and the production of gas seem to be elevated. It would take some sitting down and calculating But it is possible that the deficit could be higher than forecasted. And to Luke, Gerard, yes, putting some of the NIB resources into foreign market may be an option. We just have to factor in a portfolio similar to the HSF, which has been very resilient and has been able to generate a stable return in the medium term. Emily Najee also asked about the labor force participation rate. And what I would say is that that is not stagnant because of the Venezuelans. Our labor force participation rate is independent. What may happen is that the jobs that Trinidad and Tobago nationals are not taking, the Venezuelans may now be absorbing, like the cleaners. You even see them on garbage trucks and so on. And Devon Fleming asked about AI, and yes, AI could adversely affect the labor market. So I think we addressed all the questions there in one form or the other. Vivek, thanks.
So at this point in time, I'd like the closing comments from each of the speakers. So I think we should go in the order at which we started. So Professor Hussain, you first.
So all I will say is thank you to Rebecca and to Mark for making this session work behind the scenes. And thank you to Vivek, Dr. Tiwari, and Indira for coming on. Dr. Tiwari, for me, once I know you are speaking, I make it my business to come to these sessions. I learn a lot from you, and thank you very much for your participation.
Well, thank you for your kindness, Roger. I'm happy to participate. It was a good session. And in closing, I would just like to say that we are a very small country, and the problem that somebody raised of the transportation, the loss of productivity, and etc., and we talked about various solutions. I want to simply mention that one of the solutions is genuine decentralization. And in addition to macroeconomic strategy, also microeconomic strategies that relate to growth centers, we used to call them growth pools, and local economic development strategies. You can do that. In 2013, I think, together with the UNDP, we did a study of the local areas of Trinidad and Tobago under local government, including Tobago under the House of Assembly. And we identify in each region what were the potential growth centers and what were the deficiencies in all of those communities. And if you looked at the country like that, we only have 450,000 households in this country. We have 600 communities, and we have 1.4 million people, even with the migration, 1.5 maybe. And this is not, in my view, a hard country to have a serious development strategy for. The problem is we don't have the money. But that can be solved. And if we had a good plan and a good strategy, we could get our country where we need to be.
I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you very much to the team at TEDU for inviting me to chair this evening. I really do enjoy these sessions. I feel that they are positive. I find that the discourse, the level of discourse and the submissions that are made normally at these TEDU podcasts, as I like to call them, and particularly today, they're of high value, I feel, to the nation. And I'd like to I'm always very happy to see how many people attend. And I certainly feel that so many things that you hear today, I hope that it does change the way that you think, and that you incorporate in the way that you also think about Trinidad and Tobago, and ways that you feel you can help as well too. So thank you to everyone at TEDU.